Number 1. Henri Désiré Landru. In the early years of the 20th century, France was still reeling from the social aftershocks of industrialization, war, and economic instability. Trust was fragile. Families were fractured by conscription, poverty, and displacement. It was within this atmosphere where loneliness was common and desperation quietly widespread that Henri Désiré Landru learned how to disappear people without raising alarms. Landru was born in Paris in 1869 into a modest Catholic family. By all outward appearances, his upbringing was unremarkable. He was intelligent, methodical, and capable of presenting himself as respectable when needed. He married, had children, and lived the life of a lower middle-class Parisian man. But beneath that surface was a deep resentment towards society, paired with an obsessive need for control and financial security. Long before the murders began, Landru was already a criminal. He forged documents, committed fraud, and repeatedly manipulated women for money. He was arrested multiple times for swindling widows and vulnerable women out of savings and inheritances. Each time, he learned something new: how police tracked suspects, how victims were dismissed, and how bureaucracy slowed justice. Prison did not reform him, it refined him. The First World War became the turning point. By 1914, thousands of French men were dead or missing. Women were suddenly alone, many receiving small pensions or holding modest savings. Newspapers were filled with personal ads, widows seeking companionship, marriage, or simply security in a world that had collapsed around them. Landru understood instantly what this meant. Isolation had become normal. Disappearances were expected. Grief created blind spots. Using aliases more than a dozen over the years, Landru placed marriage advertisements in newspapers across France. He presented himself as a respectable widower, financially stable, seeking companionship with intent to marry. His letters were polite, structured, and reassuring. He promised stability. He promised affection. He promised a future. Women responded. They met him in cafes, parks, railway stations. He was calm, attentive, and convincing. Once trust was established, Landru suggested moving away together, often to a rented house in a quiet suburb, far from family or friends. He framed isolation as romance, privacy as safety. What happened next? No one witnessed. Between 1914 and 1919, at least 10 women and one teenage boy believed to be the son of one of the victims vanished after entering Landru's life. Not one was ever seen again. No bodies were found intact. No crime scenes were obvious. Landru left almost nothing behind except paperwork, and even that, he thought, he had destroyed. But Landru made one mistake. He kept records. Obsessively organized, he maintained notebooks detailing names, dates, expenses, and movements. He tracked train tickets, rental periods, and financial transactions. To him, these were tools of control. To investigators, they would become a roadmap of death. Families of the missing women began asking questions. Sisters reported letters suddenly stopping. Friends described plans that were never followed through. Some women had liquidated assets shortly before vanishing, homes sold, bank accounts emptied. All signs pointed to voluntary departure, until patterns emerged. French police, stretched thin by post-war chaos, initially dismissed many concerns. Adults had the right to disappear. There was no evidence of force, but one disappearance drew particular attention, that of Madame Buisson, whose relatives refused to accept silence. They tracked Landru themselves, piecing together his aliases and movements, eventually bringing their findings to authorities. Surveillance followed. Police observed Landru living under false names, renting properties for short periods, then abruptly moving on. When they searched one of his former residences, they found something disturbing: burned bone fragments in the garden stove. Not enough to identify a body, but enough to raise horrifying questions. Landru was arrested in 1919. The investigation that followed was unprecedented in French criminal history. Without intact bodies, prosecutors relied on circumstantial evidence, financial records, witness testimony, travelogues, and Landru's own meticulous notebooks. Each victim's last known movements aligned precisely with Landru's whereabouts. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. Each woman had entrusted him with money before vanishing. During interrogation, Landru was cold and defiant. He denied everything. He mocked investigators. He insisted the women had left him voluntarily, often running off with other men. When confronted with the bone fragments, he suggested they were from animals or trash burned by previous tenants. The trial, beginning in 1921, captivated France. The courtroom was packed daily. Newspapers printed transcripts. The public was divided, some convinced of his guilt, others disturbed by the lack of bodies. Landru himself treated the proceedings as theatre, smirking, correcting prosecutors, and presenting himself as a victim of hysteria. But the evidence told a different story. One by one, prosecutors reconstructed the disappearances. They showed how Landru drained bank accounts, how he sold furniture belonging to missing women, how he pawned jewelry, how he altered his identity each time suspicion might rise, and most damning of all, how no woman ever resurfaced, contacted family, or accessed money after meeting him. The jury deliberated for hours. In November 1921, Henri Désiré Landru was found guilty of the murders of 10 women and 1 boy. He was sentenced to death by guillotine. Even then, he never confessed. On February 25, 1922, Landru was executed outside the prison of Versailles. He walked calmly to the guillotine, refusing a blindfold, maintaining innocence to the end. No burial locations were ever revealed. No full remains were recovered. His victims exist largely through memory, documents, and absence. Landru's legacy reshaped how France viewed trust, romance, and disappearance. His crimes exposed how social upheaval creates opportunity for predators, and how bureaucracy can be manipulated by those patient enough to exploit it. He did not rely on brute force or chaos. He relied on structure, politeness, and the assumption that respectable men are harmless. He also revealed a terrifying truth: a serial killer does not need to leave bodies to destroy lives. Silence, when combined with planning, can be just as lethal. In French criminal history, Henri Désiré Landru remains a symbol not just of murder but of calculated erasure, a man who understood that in times of war and loss, the easiest victims are those society already expects to vanish. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 2. Marcel Petiot. Paris during the German occupation was a city trained to look away. People disappeared, daily arrested, deported, executed, or simply swallowed by the machinery of war. Fear conditioned silence. Paperwork replaced questions. It was the perfect environment for a man like Marcel Petiot, someone who understood not just violence, but bureaucracy, psychology, and the value of appearing indispensable. Petiot was born in 1897, in Auxerre, France. From childhood, there were signs that something was wrong. He was intelligent, but volatile, prone to lies, manipulation, and sudden cruelty. Teachers described him as erratic. Doctors later noted symptoms consistent with severe personality disorders, though such diagnoses were primitive at the time. Even as a teenager, he demonstrated an alarming lack of empathy, paired with grandiosity. World War I interrupted his early life. Petiot enlisted, was wounded, and returned a decorated veteran at least on paper. Much of his war record was later revealed to be exaggerated or outright false, but the image of a traumatized hero followed him. He used it repeatedly to excuse erratic behavior and to gain sympathy from authority figures. After the war, Petiot studied medicine. He was brilliant enough to pass exams, charming enough to gain patience, and dishonest enough to falsify records when needed. By the 1930s, he was a practicing physician in Paris, known to some as eccentric but effective. To others, he was reckless, overprescribing narcotics and morphine, often billing fraudulently. Still, he thrived. Patients trusted him. Colleagues tolerated him. The system absorbed his misconduct without consequence. Then came World War II, and with it Petiot's opportunity. By 1940, Nazi Germany occupied Paris. Jews, resistance members, and those seeking escape were desperate. Smuggling networks emerged overnight. So did informants, profiteers, and predators. Petiot presented himself as a savior. Under the alias Dr. Eugene, he claimed to operate a secret escape route to South America, particularly Argentina. For a price, he promised forged documents, transport, and safe passage, no questions asked. People believed him because they needed to. Those who came to him were often carrying their life savings, gold, jewelry, cash. They told no one. Discretion was survival. Petiot instructed them to meet him at a townhouse at 21 Rue La Soie, near the Arc des Triomphes. The house looked respectable. Medical equipment inside suggested legitimacy. He told clients vaccinations were required before travel. They never left the building. What happened inside that house was not discovered until years later, but investigators eventually reconstructed a chilling pattern. Victims were injected with lethal substances, often cyanide. Their bodies were stripped of valuables. Some were dismembered. Others were burned in a coal furnace in the basement. Remains were dumped into the Seine or buried in lime pits. Neighbors noticed strange odors, smoke at odd hours, heavy suitcases carried out at night. But wartime Paris normalized horror. No one intervened. Petiot continued operating throughout the occupation, killing again and again under the guise of rescue. He forged letters to families, suggesting successful escapes. He kept meticulous notes of valuables stolen. He lived lavishly in a starving city. His downfall began not with a victim escaping, but with fire. In March 1944, neighbors alerted authorities to thick black smoke pouring from Petiot's chimney. Firefighters entered the basement and made a discovery that froze them in place. Human remains, charred limbs, skull fragments, and a furnace still warm. Police were called immediately. Petiot was arrested, but even then he attempted to control the narrative. He claimed he was a resistance hero, that the bodies belonged to German collaborators he had executed secretly. For a brief moment, the chaos of war almost saved him. Resistance members vouched loosely. Records were unclear. The Germans, suspicious of everyone, detained him but failed to prove his claims false. Then Paris was liberated. With liberation came order, and with order came real investigation. Police returned to Rue La Soeur. They excavated the basement and surrounding areas. More remains surfaced. Suitcases filled with human bones, teeth, hair, evidence of systematic murder. Victims were identified through missing persons reports, many of whom had last been seen carrying valuables, seeking escape. In total, investigators attributed at least 24 murders to Petiot, though the true number may exceed 60. Wartime records were incomplete. Some families never reported disappearances. Some victims had no surviving relatives. During his trial in 1946, Petiot was defiant, theatrical, and disturbingly charismatic. He insulted witnesses. He mocked prosecutors. He insisted until the end that he had killed only enemies of France. But the evidence was overwhelming. Stolen goods traced to victims, forged documents, chemical supplies, and witness testimony placing victims alive inside his home, never to leave. The jury found him guilty. On May 25, 1946, Marcel Petiot was executed by guillotine at La Santé prison. He walked to his death without visible fear, reportedly joking with guards. He never expressed remorse. Petiot's crimes remain some of the most disturbing in French history, not merely because of their brutality, but because of their camouflage. He did not hunt in alleys. He did not stalk in shadows. He wore a doctor's coat. He spoke of safety. He exploited systems meant to protect the vulnerable. His victims were not just murdered, they were erased by circumstance, by war, by a society overwhelmed enough to look away. Marcel Petiot proved that the most prolific killers do not always rely on secrecy alone. Sometimes they rely on chaos. Sometimes they hide behind professions built on trust. And sometimes history itself provides the perfect cover. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Joseph Vacher. In the final years of the 19th century, rural France lived by routine and isolation. Villages were scattered, communication was slow, and the countryside was vast enough for a man to vanish between regions without leaving more than rumors behind. It was a world where shepherds walked alone for days, where young farmhands slept in open fields, and where violence could pass as misfortune if no one witnessed it. Into that world walked Joseph Vacher barefoot at times, filthy, muttering prayers and curses, appearing less like a predator and more like a broken soul drifting between towns. Joseph Vacher was born in 1869 in Beaufort, Isère, into a poor farming family. From childhood, he was considered unstable. He struggled in school, exhibited violent mood swings, and showed early signs of delusion. As a young man, he attempted suicide after being rejected by a woman he obsessed over. The attempt failed, but it left him with severe facial injuries and worsened his already fragile mental state. Vacher was institutionalized briefly, then released. That release would haunt France for decades. After leaving the asylum, Vacher began wandering the countryside. He had no fixed address, no steady work, and no one tracking his movements. He slept in barns, forests, and abandoned sheds. He begged for food, frightened villagers, and was occasionally detained for vagrancy. To many, he seemed more pathetic than dangerous, another damaged man, displaced by poverty and mental illness. But between 1894 and 1897, something far darker followed in his wake. Shepherd boys and young women began turning up dead across southeastern France. The bodies were often found in remote fields or wooded areas. Many were mutilated, throats cut, abdomens slashed. In some cases, there were signs of sexual violence and cannibalistic behavior. The brutality shocked, even hardened rural communities. Authorities initially treated each killing as an isolated incident. Different regions, different victims, different methods, or so it seemed. But as the deaths mounted, similarities became impossible to ignore. The victims were often alone, working in open land. The attacks were sudden, frenzied, and excessive, and always there were signs of a struggle but no clear suspect. Vacher was questioned more than once. He was arrested several times for minor offenses near crime scenes. He was known to locals as the Mad Tramp. He carried knives. He spoke of God and demons in the same breath. But each time, he was released. There was no unified police force, no centralized database, no forensic science capable of linking crimes across departments. Madness, at the time, was often treated as nuisance rather than threat. Meanwhile, the killings continued. Witnesses later recalled seeing Vacher near victims shortly before their deaths. Farmers reported him asking odd questions about grazing routes. Children described his staring. Some even escaped encounters with him, claiming he lunged at them with a blade before being scared off. Still, nothing stuck. The turning point came in 1897, when Vacher was arrested after attacking a woman who survived and identified him. This time, investigators refused to let the case go. A young magistrate named Michel Fourniret took particular interest. He began reviewing unsolved murders across multiple regions and, for the first time, attempted something radical, connecting them. Fourniret noticed the geographical trail. He noticed the similar wounds. He noticed the consistent profile of the victims. And he noticed that wherever these murders occurred, Joseph Vacher had been reported nearby, sometimes arrested, sometimes questioned, always released. Vacher, when interrogated, began to confess, not calmly, not coherently, but repeatedly. He claimed he was driven by divine command, that God ordered him to kill shepherds to punish sin, that demons tormented him if he resisted. He described murders in chilling detail, tales that were never published and matched crime scenes precisely. He confessed to dozens of killings, some unknown to police until that moment. Still, the legal system hesitated. Insanity was a powerful defense in 19th century France. Many believed Vacher should be confined, not executed. Others argued that despite his madness, his crimes were deliberate, methodical, and repeated proof of responsibility. Psychiatrists examined him extensively. Some declared him insane beyond reason. Others insisted he understood his actions well enough to choose them. The debate became national. Newspapers dubbed him the French Jack the Ripper. Public fear spread. Rural families kept children indoors. Shepherd work declined. Panic followed wherever his name appeared. Ultimately, the court ruled against him. Joseph Vacher was found legally responsible for his crimes. He was convicted of multiple murders, though the exact number remains uncertain. Officially, he was held accountable for 11 killings. Unofficially, historians estimate his true toll may exceed 30. On December 31, 1898, Joseph Vacher was executed by guillotine in Bergen-Bresse. He reportedly approached his death calmly, muttering prayers. With his execution, a wave of relief swept through the countryside, but also a lingering unease. Vacher's case changed France. It exposed the deadly consequences of fragmented policing. It forced the justice system to confront the intersection of mental illness and criminal responsibility, and it demonstrated, for the first time, that a single individual could terrorize an entire nation by exploiting distance, isolation, and institutional blindness. He did not hide behind charm or respectability. He hid behind chaos, behind poverty, behind the assumption that madness made him harmless. Joseph Vacher remains one of the earliest recognized serial killers in French history, not because he was the first to kill repeatedly, but because his case revealed the pattern, a pattern France could no longer afford to ignore. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Michel Fourniret. For decades, Michel Fourniret moved through France and neighboring countries with the appearance of an ordinary man, unremarkable, quiet, and forgettable. He blended into rural landscapes, into border towns, into the gaps between police jurisdictions. What no one saw at first was that he was carefully building a private world of abduction, captivity, and murder, one that would eventually place him among the most prolific serial killers in French history. Fourniret was born in 1942 in Sedan, near the Belgian border. From adolescence, he displayed troubling behavior, voyeurism, sexual violence, and obsessive fantasies centered on domination. As a young adult, he committed rape and attempted murder, crimes for which he was convicted and imprisoned. But when he was released, the system treated his past as closed. There was no lifetime monitoring, no long-term psychological containment. He married, had children, and learned how to appear compliant. That ability to appear normal became his greatest weapon. By the late 1980s and 1990s, Fourniret had refined a pattern. He targeted girls and young women, often teenagers, choosing victims who were alone, hitchhiking, or vulnerable. He used false authority, posing as a police officer, a concerned passerby, or a man offering help. Once trust was established, he abducted them and transported them across borders, often into Belgium, where jurisdictional confusion worked in his favor. What followed was systematic cruelty. Victims were held captive, sometimes for days, sometimes longer. Fourniret raped them repeatedly. He interrogated them about their lives, their families, their fears. Control was not incidental, it was the purpose. When he believed the risk of discovery was rising, or when he felt finished, he killed them, often strangling or suffocating them, then burying the bodies in remote locations he believed would never be searched. For years, families searched in vain. Girls vanished without witnesses. Some cases were classified as runaways. Others simply went cold. Fourniret's crimes crossed borders in decades, and without a central connecting thread, police could not see the full picture. But Fourniret was not alone. In the late 1980s, he met Monique Olivier, a woman who would become his wife, an accomplice. Olivier was not a passive observer. She helped lure victims, reassured them, assisted in captivity, and later provided alibis. Her presence allowed Fourniret to appear even more trustworthy. A married couple, seemingly harmless, offering help. Together, they created a killing partnership that thrived on secrecy and routine. The case finally began to unravel in 2003, when a young Belgian girl disappeared. Witness descriptions and vehicle sightings led police to Fourniret. When arrested, he initially denied everything, but investigators had learned from past failures. They interrogated methodically. They confronted him with inconsistencies, and crucially, they turned their attention to Monique Olivier. Under pressure, Olivier began to talk. What followed shocked Europe. Fourniret confessed not just to one murder, but to many. He led police to burial sites. Bodies were exhumed from forests and fields long thought empty. Each confession peeled back another layer of failure, missed warnings, dismissed reports, prior convictions that should have prevented his freedom. By the time of his trials, Fourniret had admitted to at least 11 murders. Investigators believe the true number may be higher, with possible victims never identified or remains never found. The crimes spanned decades and countries, exploiting the very structure of modern Europe: open borders, fragmented policing, and delayed information sharing. In court, Fourniret showed little emotion. He corrected details. He minimized suffering. He framed his actions as compulsions rather than choices. Monique Olivier, meanwhile, attempted to recast herself as a victim of manipulation, though evidence showed her active participation. Fourniret was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Olivier received multiple life sentences as well. In 2021, Fourniret died in prison before all suspected cases could be fully tried, leaving unanswered questions and unresolved grief. Michel Fourniret's legacy is one of systemic failure as much as personal monstrosity. He demonstrated how known sexual predators, once released, can escalate when oversight disappears. He showed how collaboration between killer and accomplice can multiply harm. And he exposed how borders, meant to connect nations, can also be used to hide crimes when coordination fails. He was not a killer who relied on sudden violence or chaos. He relied on patience, on planning, on the assumption that no one was watching closely enough. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Guy Georges. In the late 1990s, Paris projected confidence. Surveillance cameras expanded, forensic science improved, and violent crime appeared increasingly containable. Yet beneath that sense of control, a predator moved through the city with unnerving studying routines, exploiting trust, and leaving behind scenes so methodically scrubbed that investigators struggled to keep pace. His name was Guy Georges, and for years he proved that even a modern capital could be hunted. Born in 1962 in France, Guy Georges grew up amid instability. His childhood was marked by neglect, emotional isolation, and early encounters with delinquency. As a teenager, he drifted between petty crimes and short stints of incarceration. What distinguished him was not intelligence or charisma, but patience and ability to wait, to watch, to rehearse violence privately, while presenting himself publicly as unremarkable. By the early 1990s, Georges had settled into Paris. He lived cheaply, worked sporadically, and spent long hours roaming neighborhoods on foot. He learned building layouts, door mechanisms, stairwells, and escape routes. He observed women returning home alone. He memorized schedules. He noted which entrances were poorly lit and which residents were likely to help a stranger carrying groceries. His attacks followed a chillingly consistent pattern. Georges targeted young women, often students or professionals living alone. He gained access to their apartments through deception or sudden force, overwhelming them quickly to prevent screams. Inside, he raped and strangled his victims, then meticulously cleaned the scene-washing surfaces, removing objects he touched, and sometimes rearranging furniture to mislead investigators. He took small personal items, not as trophies, but to erase traces of his presence. Between 1991 and 1997, a series of murders shocked Paris. The victims shared similarities in age and circumstance. The crime scene suggested sexual violence and strangulation, but yielded frustratingly little physical evidence. Georges wore gloves. He avoided injury. He left no fingerprints. At a time when DNA databases were still limited, his caution paid off. Police worked tirelessly, but the cases remained stubbornly disconnected. Each murder seemed isolated by neighborhood and timing. Public anxiety rose. Women changed routines. Newspapers speculated about a phantom killer who knew the city too well. The breakthrough came not from a dramatic chase, but from persistence and technological progress. In 1997, Georges attacked another woman who survived. Her testimony, combined with witness sightings and partial forensic traces, allowed investigators to narrow their focus. Around the same time, advances in DNA analysis enabled labs to extract usable genetic material from evidence previously considered insufficient. A profile began to form. When Georges was arrested later that year for an unrelated offense, investigators quietly collected his DNA. The match was definitive. The genetic evidence linked him to multiple murders across Paris, crimes that had terrorized the city for years. When confronted, Georges initially denied responsibility, then slowly began to confess, offering details only the killer could know. He showed no remorse, describing his actions with detachment, as though recounting errands rather than lives destroyed. At trial, prosecutors laid out a portrait of calculated violence. Georges was convicted of at least 7 murders, though investigators believed the true number may be higher. He received a sentence of life imprisonment without parole, ensuring he would never walk free. Guy Georges forced France to confront a sobering reality. Modern cities do not eliminate predators, they simply change how predators operate. He exploited anonymity, routine, and the assumption that safety increases with infrastructure. His case accelerated improvements in forensic coordination, victim support, and DNA databases nationwide. He also left a quieter lesson, one less comforting than the promise of technology. Evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it blends in, walks familiar streets, and waits patiently for the moment no one is watching. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Thierry Paulin Paris in the 1980s was changing. Beneath the glamour of fashion houses and café terraces, entire neighborhoods were quietly aging. Elderly residents lived alone in apartments they had occupied for decades, often forgotten by family and overlooked by social services. It was within this overlooked demographic people who rarely complained, who trusted easily, who were assumed to die of natural causes that Thierry Paulin found his victims. Thierry Paulin was born in 1963 in Martinique and moved to mainland France as a child. From an early age, his life was marked by instability. He struggled academically, bounced between care systems, and showed early signs of behavioral disturbance. As a teenager, he became involved in petty crime, prostitution, and drug use. Violence was not foreign to him, it was normalized. By the time he reached adulthood, Paulin had settled in Paris. He drifted between low-paying jobs and periods of unemployment, supporting himself through theft and fraud. Those who knew him described him as charismatic, but volatile, capable of charm one moment and sudden aggression the next. He was deeply influenced by nightlife culture, surrounding himself with others who lived on the margins. What made Paulin particularly dangerous was not intelligence or planning, but audacity. In the mid-1980s, elderly Parisians began dying under suspicious circumstances. At first, the deaths were classified as accidents or natural causes. Many victims were found strangled, but investigators often attributed this to falls, medical episodes, or self-inflicted injury. The victims lived alone. There were no witnesses. Their deaths did not raise immediate alarms. Then patterns began to surface. Victims were almost exclusively elderly women. Many lived in the same area. Some were discovered with signs of blunt force trauma. Others showed evidence of suffocation or strangulation. In several cases, apartments appeared ransacked but only superficially. Small amounts of money or jewelry were missing, but valuables were often left behind. What confused investigators was the lack of forced entry. Neighbors reported nothing unusual. Doors were locked, windows intact. It appeared the victims had let their killer inside. Paulin exploited this trust mercilessly. He posed as a delivery worker, a utility employee, or simply a polite young man asking to use the phone. Elderly residents, accustomed to a more trusting era, opened their doors. Once inside, Paulin attacked with sudden, overwhelming violence. Many victims were beaten, then strangled. Some were assaulted sexually. The attacks were short, chaotic, and intensely personal. Between 1984 and 1987, the death toll rose quietly. Police were slow to connect the cases. France had not yet fully adapted to the concept of serial murder within its urban elderly population. Many investigators resisted the idea that someone was deliberately targeting old women across the city. The victims were often written off as isolated tragedies rather than part of a larger pattern. Meanwhile, Paulin grew bolder. He attacked in daylight. He struck repeatedly within the same neighborhoods. He showed little concern for witnesses, sometimes passing neighbors on staircases, moments before or after killings. The randomness of his movements made surveillance nearly impossible. The turning point came not from forensic brilliance, but from chance and persistence. In 1987, Paulin attacked another elderly woman who survived. She described her attacker as a young man who had forced his way inside. Around the same time, police received tips about a man seen loitering near victims' buildings. Investigators began narrowing their focus to individuals with access, mobility, and a history of violence. Paulin was arrested later that year on unrelated charges. During interrogation, inconsistencies in his statements raised suspicion. When questioned more aggressively, he began to unravel. His confessions were staggering. Paulin admitted to killing at least 18 elderly women, though some estimates placed the number closer to 21. He described entering apartments, attacking without hesitation, and leaving bodies behind with chilling detachment. His accomplice, Thierry Paulin, assisted in several cases, acting as lookout or helping with theft, though Paulin was the primary killer. The public reaction was immediate and furious. Newspapers dubbed him La Tueur de Vieilles Dames, the killer of old women. Parisians were horrified, not just by the number of victims, but by how long the killings had gone unnoticed. Questions were raised about policing priorities, ageism, and how society treats its most vulnerable members. During his trial, Paulin displayed erratic behavior. He oscillated between boasting, denial, and apparent confusion. Psychiatrists diagnosed him with severe personality disorders and possible neurological damage linked to illness. Despite this, the court ruled him criminally responsible. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1989. Paulin did not live long enough to serve it. In 1989, while incarcerated, Thierry Paulin died of complications related to AIDS at the age of 25. His death brought no closure to families. There were no final confessions, no explanations, no remorse, just silence. Thierry Paulin's crimes left a lasting scar on France. They forced authorities to confront how easily serial violence can hide behind assumptions about age, class, and vulnerability. His victims were not targeted for who they were individually, but for what society believed about them, that they were invisible, that their deaths would not prompt urgent questions. Paulin exploited trust in its purest form. He weaponized politeness. He turned routine kindness into a death sentence. And he exposed how quickly violence can escalate when warning signs are ignored. Unlike many serial killers, Paulin did not seek control through long captivity or elaborate planning. His murders were fast, chaotic, and fueled by impulse. That impulsivity, combined with systemic neglect, allowed him to kill again and again before anyone truly noticed. In French criminal history, Thierry Paulin stands as a grim reminder that danger does not always announce itself with spectacle. Sometimes it knocks politely, sometimes it waits on the other side of a familiar door, and sometimes it thrives because no one believes the vulnerable are being hunted. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Francis Heaulme in the late 20th century. As France modernized its police forces and embraced forensic coordination, a different kind of threat slipped through the cracks, one born not of careful planning or elaborate deception, but of chaos, transience, and systemic blind spots. Francis Heaulme did not look like a mastermind. He looked lost, and that, for years, allowed him to kill again and again. Francis Heaulme was born in 1959 in Metz, in northeastern France. His childhood was fractured from the start. Raised in a deeply unstable household marked by alcoholism and violence, Heaulme grew up learning that pain was ordinary and accountability was optional. He struggled in school, displayed violent outbursts, and began drinking heavily at an early age. By his teens, alcohol was not a habit, it was a dependency. As an adult, Heaulme drifted. He had no fixed address, no stable employment, and no lasting relationships. He moved between towns, construction sites, hostels, and friends' couches. He drank constantly. He fought often. Police encountered him repeatedly for assaults, public intoxication, and petty crime. Each time, he was processed, released, and forgotten. What no one understood yet was that Heaulme's violence did not stop at brawls. Beginning in the mid-1980s, bodies began to appear across France. Women, children, sometimes elderly victims, killed in brutal, impulsive attacks. The crime scenes varied wildly. Some victims were strangled, others beaten to death. Some showed sexual assault, others appeared to be killed in sudden fits of rage. There was no consistent method, no clear victim profile, no obvious geographic center, and that inconsistency became his shield. Heaulme often encountered his victims by chance at bus stops, near construction sites, in isolated outdoor areas. Alcohol fueled his impulses. Rage triggered violence. Afterwards, he wandered on, sometimes hitchhiking out of town the same day. There was rarely evidence tying him to the scene beyond eyewitness memories that blurred under time and trauma. France's policing system at the time was not designed to catch someone like him. Investigations remained local. Cases were handled by regional departments with limited data sharing. A murder in one department was not easily linked to a similar crime hundreds of kilometers away, especially when the methods differed. Heaulme exploited this without knowing it. He was not he was simply moving. By the early 1990s, investigators began noticing something unsettling. A man matching a vague description appeared repeatedly near murder scenes across different regions. Witnesses described a disheveled, intoxicated individual. Sometimes he was aggressive, sometimes withdrawn, always forgettable enough to fade into crowds. The breakthrough came through confession, but not the kind police usually trust. In 1992, Heaulme was arrested for the murder of an 8-year-old girl in Montigny-les Metz. During interrogation, he confessed, then he recanted, then he confessed to other murders, then he denied them. His statements were erratic, contradictory, and soaked in alcohol-induced confusion. At first, investigators dismissed many of his claims as fantasy, but some details were too precise to ignore. As police cross-checked his movements, employment records, and witness accounts, patterns emerged. Heaulme had been near multiple crime scenes at the relevant times. He knew details that had never been public. Slowly, case by case, the scope of his violence came into focus. Francis Heaulme was eventually linked to at least 9 confirmed murders, though authorities believe the true number may be significantly higher. Some estimates suggest he may be responsible for dozens of killings, many still officially unsolved. His lack of a fixed pattern made certainty elusive. His trials were chaotic. Psychiatric evaluations described severe alcoholism, personality disorders, and impaired impulse control, but not legal insanity. He understood what he was doing, even if he could not control himself. Victims' families watched as he vacillated between cold indifference and emotional collapse, offering no coherent explanation for the lives he destroyed. In 2017, after decades of investigation and multiple trials, Heaulme was sentenced to life imprisonment. The verdict brought partial closure but also frustration. Too many questions remained unanswered. Too many families never received confirmation. Too many crimes may never be definitively attributed. Francis Heaulme represents a different category of prolific killer, one shaped less by ideology or fantasy than by neglect, addiction, and systemic failure. He was not invisible because he was clever. He was invisible because no one expected chaos itself to be lethal on such a scale. His case forced France to re-evaluate how it tracks transient offenders, how it handles repeat violent arrests, and how easily fragmented systems can be exploited by someone who never stays still long enough to be noticed. He did not plan to become a serial killer. He drifted into it, carried by addiction, rage, and indifference, his own and society's alike. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary.